I like the title of this panel. There is an obvious desire to search for solutions. That's the word of the panel. That's the title of the panel, and to find constructive paths forward. Given the fact that the collective, I'm not sure how to handle this, but the collective of the Sudan and South Sudan has experienced violent conflict for most of its history as an independent state or as independent states, I would caution that any effort to find a way forward is likely to continue to be fraught. Allow me to take, Bob knows where I'm going with this, because I tend to take a critical perspective or a more pessimistic approach to conflict resolution, to the idea of constructive paths forward, to the idea of search for solutions, and instead I will offer some thoughts on the challenges associated with conflict resolution and state building in the Sudan, the Horn of Africa, and maybe Africa more generally. So I have this as a series of questions, and I am famous for asking questions and having in the way of answers. So that's one of my many liabilities. My first observation is to note the assumption that there are solutions to violent conflicts, and that these solutions are to be found in the form of peace agreements. But in the case of the Sudan and other politically complex states, one is right to ask about solutions to what? Solutions to which of the many real or potential conflicts or dimensions of conflict within the country? Interestingly, some scholarship has argued that the 2005 CPA Comprehensive Peace Agreement actually contributed to tensions and violence that continues today, albeit indirectly. Most view the CPA as a good agreement that was, as its title suggests, comprehensive. It has been said, however, that the agreement and its protocols were nonetheless insufficiently comprehensive, that they were signed by only 2 groups, and consequently that they left other groups, perhaps 1/3 of the population, out. They did not take into consideration the security concerns of other marginalized or exploited groups that have remained in the Sudan in the north, that secession in ethnically complex states makes those left behind even more vulnerable and likely to be exploited. Comprehensiveness, I put that in quotation marks, is an elusive, if not elusive goal. Agreements that are comprehensive are also, are of course desirable, but are also, I think, less likely to be achieved and must be traded off against agreements which are less ambitious, but are perhaps more likely to be achieved. That's question 1. Question 2. Is there consensus among the experts on the best way forward? I'm working on a book right now called, provocatively, Why Conflict Resolution Fails. And one of my findings so far is, by examining the conflict resolution literature, is that there is a remarkable lack of consensus on the most effective way to get to peace. While it is fashionable to assume that empowering the people through democratic elections, through inclusiveness and decentralization are the key to peace, I would challenge anyone who assumes that on their own and within the confines of a territorially limited state, more openness, more civil society, more democracy automatically lead to peace. Alternatively, while many argue in favor of stronger political institutions, that's a key word, proponents often do not demonstrate how institutions are to be created. Institutions are not, from my perspective, easily created by outsiders. Marina Ottaway says what outsiders can do is create organizations only. Institutions are outgrowths of existing patterns of local behavior, and thus require generations, as Bob says, rather than just peace agreements to evolve. Question 3, is doing something better than doing nothing? Some scholars have argued in favor of more controversial approaches to conflict management. And I don't know if you've seen this. You probably know an earlier version of it, but in a 2012 editorial in the New York Times, Gerard Prunier argued that the prospect of a negotiated solution is no longer in the cards, and that President Omar al-Bashir can no longer be trusted. Instead, he says, and these are his words, an all-out civil war may be the best way to permanently oust Mr. Bashir and minimize casualties, end of quote. This give war a chance approach to conflict resolution is not only counterintuitive, but also, of course, raises all kinds of terrible ethical and moral questions. From Prunier's perspective, however, low-intensity conflict that festers forever creates humanitarian disasters that are no less painful than a conflict that ends in victory by one side. Food for thought. Question 4, particularly relevant to Sudan, is secession the answer for managing political complexity? Excuse me, there's a typo there, obviously. All states are politically complex from the perspective of outsiders, especially Westerners. And Sudan's complexity is arguably mind-boggling. But are states better off if they are ethnically and culturally pluralistic? Or are they better off, to the extent that this is possible, when a given state represents a single group, ethnic group, or identity? In other words, does the secession of southern Sudan represent a reasonable step in the right direction in terms of creating more ethnically homogeneous states? Or is this a fool's game insofar as the simple secession of one group from another cannot untangle a far more complex and fluid set of relationships and conflicts? To what extent has secession reduced the conflict, and to what extent has it replaced old conflicts with new ones? Something we talked about briefly yesterday in the session that I was in. If the South and North are better off without each other, are the Nuer and the Dinka also better off without each other? When does it end? Question 5. Do belligerents want peace? Do they really want peace? There is the further assumption that among Westerners, I think that conflict, there is a further assumption amongst Western conflict resolution proponents that all belligerents want peace, and that when an agreement is signed, its provisions will be abided by, and peace will follow. But I sometimes wonder if that logic is flawed, particularly when there are numerous real or potential belligerents. Somalis are well aware of the false promise of peace agreements, having endured as many as 14, depending on how you count them, significant efforts in resolving conflict there. And this is where I may get myself into even more trouble. But however irrational or grotesque the actions of leaders or belligerents, however grotesque their actions may be, most of them have a keen sense of how to manage their own survival. The acceptance or rejection of any peace agreement is, from my perspective, almost always related to decisions of this nature, that is, their political survival. In other words, belligerents do not make peace because peace is something that is objectively good, or because a given agreement serves the common good. Rather, they do so, as far as I'm concerned, because it serves their political interests at that time. This does not mean that there should be no efforts in striving for peace. Rather, that arriving at peace agreements which simultaneously serve the interests of all parties in politically complex states is an extraordinarily difficult task. 6. If you're wondering when this is going to end, it ends at 7. Does anyone know what the future Sudanese state should look like? Or maybe the future state in Africa? I think there needs to be lots more thinking along these lines. It is often fashionable to denigrate Africa's colonial borders as nonsensical, as arbitrary, as therefore illegitimate. But given the situation that post-independence leaders faced at the time, it's still hard to see what the alternatives might have been or might be now. It is true that African borders often divided people that might otherwise have formed one ethnic group or one religious group or one identity group, or that amalgamated groups might have been better off if they had developed as separate or had a separate or independent existence. But all groups are inclined to have internal cleavages of one sort or another. And as the Somali case demonstrates, or has demonstrated, a common language or ethnic identity or religion is no guarantee of solidarity and peace. At least some of the contemporary literature on conflict resolution also claims that ethnic pluralism rather than ethnic homogeneity is the more promising route to peace. On the other hand, while outsiders may talk about the importance of civic identity, it is difficult to find a single country in the developing world that does not base its leadership in large or small part on personal, clan, ethnic, religious, or clientelist relations. Any future peace agreement or process will surely have to be aware of these realities. And finally, will the role of outsiders be constructive? Conflict resolution never takes place in a vacuum. There are always conflicting interests from surrounding states. As the ongoing conflict in Syria demonstrates, I think, despite the brutality of the war and the calls from many non-combatants for reason, which means an end to war, it turns out that outsiders are clearly willing to sacrifice peace if it means that key interests are served. I worry that this is also true in the Sudan. In conclusion, I'll say that my view is that it is often easier to talk about conflict resolution in the abstract, or to assume that belligerents will abandon their interests and accept principles of inclusion and democratization. All reasonable solutions when they are defined by outsiders. It is easy to talk about conflict resolution in terms of platitudes. I understand the imperative to do something and to do it in a timely manner. Perhaps the worst thing that we can do is to engage in endless talk at the expense of action, particularly when people are suffering. On the other hand, it remains essential, I think, that proposed solutions be critically examined and not simply reflect the perspectives of outsiders, but in fact look at the views of the Sudanese people themselves. Thanks a lot.